Do you ever stop and wonder why video games don't delve into serious topics more often? I mean, there are plenty of game mechanic-friendly topics in the news. The investment strategies of too-big-to-fail financial organizations, ongoing wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, the mechanizations of an increasingly polarized political system, the groundswell of revolutions during the Arab Spring. But more often than not, games end up being totally divorced from reality, taking place in science fiction or high fantasy worlds that provide convenient answers to the questions of who you're shooting and why. So why can't we have games about serious topics? Well, I think Far Cry 2 is a good example of that. First, let's get some history out of the way. The original Far Cry was developed by Crytek in Germany. It was a pretty game that was more about showing off their fancy new Crytek engine than doing any extraordinarily inventive game design. However, by trying to show off the sprawling island vistas that the engine was capable of, they actually enabled the player to approach fights from different angles. At the time, this was a breath of fresh air after seeing so many Half-Life-inspired corridor shooters. This is largely the only idea that Far Cry 2 has in common with the original Far Cry. After the first game was released, Crytek jumped ship from Ubisoft to EA, leaving Ubisoft with a license to exploit, but no developer lined up to take it. So now picture yourself as a manager at Ubisoft Montreal. Management comes to you and says that they've got this great new franchise they want you to make a game for. Except it was really more of a tech demo for an engine that they no longer have access to. How do you make a sequel to it? Well, my guess is it went something like this. Man, how are we going to make a sequel to what is basically just a tech demo of a game engine? Well, we'll keep what works, the open world objectives. Hell, we'll make the whole damn thing an open world game. Ooh, I like that. What else? We'll emphasize immersion. We'll never cut out a first-person view even when doing cutscenes or getting in and out of vehicles. Yes, tell me more. And we'll set the whole thing in the political and ethnic struggles of an African civil war. I don't think that we should... Plus we could introduce forest fires as a mechanic. Yeah, fires are neat. And so we arrive at Far Cry 2, a game with messy mechanics and even messier political commentary. As previously mentioned, the game is an open-world first-person shooter. The core of the game's design is to create hilarious and memorable stories through emergent play. For example, here's an instance where I was betrayed by my own explosive-tipped arrow. Of course, there was that time the bad guys decided to run over one of their own. Or that time I killed that dude by shooting the ammo dump he was standing next to. The game manages to produce these sorts of stories the same way that Dwarf Fortress or Minecraft do, by creating simple mechanics that all interact and cross-mingle to produce beautifully complicated results. Firing bullets often causes explosions. Explosions lead to fire that can spread dynamically and quickly trap you or your enemies. Fire itself can explode more things. Guns age over time and can end up jamming, or in the case of a rocket launcher, misfiring an out-of-control rocket all over the place. And disease can hit at any time, especially in the middle of a tense firefight. The result is a game that manages to engender these awesome stories because all of the mechanics flow in and out of one another. That's not to say the game isn't flawed, just that when it works really well. But for every wacky arrow or guy who gets run over by a car, there's also a lot of really boring busy work. First of all, most good open-world games are pretty densely populated with stuff to do. Burnout Paradise is an event at every intersection, and you're never more than a few hundred feet from a town or a dungeon in Fallout New Vegas. Far Cry 2 is more sparsely populated. For example, here's the drive from your weapon stash all the way over to the town where you get your missions. That's sped up to be twice as fast, and that's the quickest route. There are only a few quick travel locations, and they're really, really spread out, so just be prepared to do a lot of driving in this game. Honestly, the game is less an open world shooter and more of a road trip simulator where you stop and shoot people every couple of 100 feet. You know, I know adaptations were on the last episode, but I can't help but think we're a scenery change away from a natural-born killer's game here. And, honestly, there's no getting around the fact that despite the game's best efforts, it's still possible to have a completely boring experience with this game. All of the wacky emergent fun only happens if you're going into combat with non-standard weapons. How are you going to take out those snipers when you have just a flare gun and a tranquilizer rifle? How are you going to take out an entire convoy using nothing but a flamethrower and a grenade? But if you don't use the game's more interesting weapons, the combat falls sort of flat. It becomes a by-the-numbers shooter, and all of those interesting mechanics, the disease and the gun jams and the forest fires, just become annoyances that further hamper an exceptionally boring shooter rather than exciting wrenches thrown into your elaborate planning. It's really easy to end up experiencing this as a game where you'll drive for 5 minutes to reach a minute and a half of generic shooting at a location you were already at 20 minutes before, and I think that's where a lot of the hate on the internet for this game comes from. Still, when you're willing to put the effort in to make the game fun, it works really well. An open-world shooter that encourages wacky, funny, or at the very least interesting play through a combination of really tightly interwound mechanics. Still, there is that issue of narrative I have to come back to. So the premise is you're a mercenary sent into the dark heart of a fictional African country ravaged by drought, disease, famine, and, of course, civil war, in an effort to kill the man responsible for arming both sides of the conflict. His name is the Jackal, and, of course, your employers give you absolutely no information about how to find him. So the protagonist, being the most unethical hitman ever, and that's gotta be saying something, decides to start doing odd jobs for both sides of the conflict in order to find him. And, to be honest, if there's one thing about the game that it actually does well, it's this concept of moral ambiguity. Your character perpetuates a terrible war in order to find and kill the guy who started it. Both sides of the conflict are corrupt factions vying for power at the expense of the nation and of its people. When in the field, it's basically impossible to tell which side of the war mercenaries are on. As far as you're concerned, they're just guys with guns who want to shoot you. I mean, seriously, between this and this, can you tell me which one is the freedom fighter and which one is the nationalist? And at the end of the game, when you're running away with the Jackal and a bounty of diamonds has been placed on your head, you're being hunted not just by both factions, but by former allies as well. There's not really a traditional good guy here. There's no one to root for, not even yourself. And if nothing else, this sort of moral ambiguity should be lauded, especially after games like BioShock and Infamous, which tried to paint morality as a false dichotomy between being the most rosy-cheeked cherub in the entire garden and being a murderous sociopath out to destroy everybody just because he can. A few other things also work okay. First of all, collectible diamonds are the currency of the land. Ignoring the fact that the game conveniently sidesteps diamond cartels and mining conditions in Africa, it's at least a clever metaphor for Western influence. Diamonds are something that Western mercenaries like you want, and you use those diamonds to bring in more weapons to further the conflict. It's actually a pretty good example of a mechanic and a metaphor coming together to facilitate commentary through play. They're hidden all throughout the land, and you use your radar to find them in various... Wait a minute. Is that a Jeep? Oh, God, it is! What brain-dead marketing hack jerk-off thought that associating their product with African civil strife was a good idea?
It's the perfect vehicle for a number of reasons. The iconic past, the relationship with the U.S. Army, and the fact that it's been a relevant vehicle for both armies and off-road enthusiasts for 70 years.
Oh, God. Do you have anything to say in your defense?
The 2011 Jeep Wrangler, Call of Duty Black Ops Edition.
Do you guys even play the games you're putting your products into, or do you just put it into anything that has off-roading? You realize this is how your product is being presented to the world, correct?
I need to guard the gold at the cistern, but I need your help. The APR troops will be on...
Jeep. Have fun out there. Oh, and that disease I keep mentioning? Yeah, that's malaria. In order to keep attacks at bay, you need to do missions for the local underground. These missions are the only time in the game where you'll see civilians. You know, the people you're ostensibly supposed to care about the wanton slaughter of, and whose country you want to help set right. These mechanics bother me for two reasons. First of all, it's just a lazy way to engender empathy to the people of this country. We don't see bodies piling up in the streets. We don't see people watching their homes and everything they've ever worked for burned to the ground. We don't see refugee camps with terrible sanitary conditions and too little food to go around. Instead, we see this guy and the only two females in the entire country sitting around, all waiting for you, some Western asshole with a shotgun, to come free them. For a game that largely condemns Western intervention, it just rings hollow. It's a shallow, empty, emotional gut punch that's just there to make us feel empathy for these NPCs that don't really matter until the end of the game anyways. Second of all, if Wikipedia is to be believed, every year almost 700,000 people die from malaria. 90% of those cases are in sub-Saharan Africa, and most of the fatalities are children. Yet, Far Cry 2 treats it more as a hilarious way to mess with the player, and an excuse to insert a catalyst for side missions that are empty, shallow attempts at emotional engineering. This ultimately ties into the core problem the game suffers from. We never see a true human cost of the war we're supposed to feel helpless to stop. Of course, any war is a travesty, resulting in the careless loss of human life. Civil wars are particularly terrible, tearing families and communities apart as lines are drawn. And then there's the unavoidable reality that civil wars in Africa often involve ethnic and religious prosecution. Rwanda was only 15 years ago, and the genocide in Darfur was making headlines during the development of this very game. By setting the game in a war-torn African society, they had the opportunity to say something profound about the nature of African wars fueled by Western money and arms, to make a call for social justice in an area that hasn't seen enough of it, to really make a profound statement about anything, really, in a way that games never have tried to do before. Instead, we got this. We have a game whose narrative is desperate to discuss subjects like moral ambiguity at wartime, or the social cost to African nations of Western interest and influence. But we also have a game whose gameplay is about wacky fun time with guns. Game designers have a name for this. Ludonarrative dissonance! Which is ironic, given that the lead designer on this game, Clint Hawking, is the one who coined the term. It basically means when your story and your gameplay are at odds or contradict one another. For example, say your game's story is about a snarky everyman who just wants the treasure and the girl, but the game is actually about shooting dudes in the face. How do you reconcile Nathan Drake, the wisecracking adventurer with a heart of gold?
You overlooked one little detail, didn't you, partner?
What?
Face it, genius, you've been played. Oh, really?
And Nathan Drake, serial murderer and military-grade munitions expert.
Uh-oh! Oh, God!
And the answer is you can't reconcile these differences. There's a disconnect between the story the developers want to tell you and the game the developers want you to play. And it's the same problem here. Far Cry 2, the narrative, strives to be Blood Diamond or Heart of Darkness. It wants to present the horrors of war and the ways Western influence perpetuates these conflicts through arms and treasure. But when I'm playing the game, all I can do is laugh when my rocket misfires and does loop-de-loops only to blow up my own truck. Far Cry 2 failed because its setting and thematic content tried to say something profound, but the gameplay took another path. The game is fun and funny, and I had a blast playing it, but I don't think that's something I should be able to say about a game about African civil wars. And apparently the developers agreed. Far Cry 3 has ditched the African setting, the moral ambiguity, and the pretense about being anything other than shooting guys entirely. You know, ultimately I think it's just sad to see a game come so far and yet fall so short. I mean, you'd never see a film that looked like this, would you?
The entire rebel army has put a bounty on your head.
Must be doing something right.
They burn it down. Nothing left.
It's over.
Get off your butt and build it again. You hear me?
Tom, wait. See where wait gets you?
This place does not need more guns.
Why don't you fight the evil in this place your way and let me fight it mine?
Oh God, I should just quit while I'm ahead. I'll see you next time.